Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega, and I'm going to be talking about something that I've never really talked about in the podcast before. But see, George and I have been kind of doing a little mini series about the God topic, in our recent podcasts. We've done two so far. Because George, he's kind of a pantheist, but he's recently described himself as an acutheist, and so he's been explaining that to me in recent episodes, and I have this kind of idea that at first I want to clarify that I just for people who might be listening to this for the first time is that for the past 2 years or so I've called myself an atheist because I grew up believing in the biblical God of Christianity, which there's so many different conflicts about that. But I found it to be incoherent, and largely there were several problems with that. But as George has brought to my attention recently, it's kind of interesting. There needs to be something worth discussing because we can't just say God doesn't exist, because we have to define, well, what is God? And then once somebody defines their version of God, then you have to say, well, you either believe in that God or you don't believe in that God. And so what I'm going to present today is going to sound really whack up to a lot of people, but it's the idea that rather than there being a God that is the creator of life, rather that life is eternal. That due to my I already have this belief, in determinism, that we live in a deterministic universe. Everything has a cause, and so there's sort of an infinite regress that happens. It seems to me that all systems that you have, like if you do believe in a God of like a monotheistic God, if you're a Christian or Jew or Muslim and you believe that God existed eternally, well, then you must ask the question: is God alive? Because if you answer that God is alive and God's existed eternally, then life is eternal. And if you answer that, well, no, God isn't alive, but he created life, well, how does a not alive thing create life? How does a dead thing create life? And so, we're going to be exploring, well, what is life? How is life defined? And as George said before we started this podcast, there's many different definitions of life. I'm like, well, hey, there's different definitions of God, there's different definitions of life, there's different definitions of everything. But I do think that there still has to be a so-called right answer. Just like, this is the Free Will, Science, and Religion podcast. And so when we talk about free will not existing, we clarify that we mean the libertarian contra-causal type of weird free will that's so incoherent it can't exist. And sure, somebody the compatibilists have tried to come up with other definitions of free will, but the main point is that certain definitions are more important than others, even though there's people who say, well, you can't say there's one right definition of things, But, I mean, of course, that's a whole nother podcast right there. And I want to stay on topic here because George is letting me introduce this. But anyway, the point is, I don't think life comes from non-life. So whatever sort of God you have, whether that God is, whether it's some immaterial deity like a lot of weird religions talk about, or it's the universe, as George has said before, you have to consider, is it alive? And if it's not alive, then how does life come from it? There's a certain point at which life, which I'm going to go with what I think life is right now, and George and I will discuss this, and I'm sure the other co-hosts are going to tell me how whack I am, and they're and all this stuff in the future, and going to say that my definition of life is wrong. But here's my thought about life: is that living things, as far as I know, have some sort of consciousness. They're aware of something, and that they intentionally do things. And of course, we're not saying that life has a free will. We're just saying that everything's causal and that life causally chooses things just like anything else. And so I tend to think that, life evolved more intentionally rather than through some, quote unquote, random mutations. Because since everything has a cause, we know that things happen causally, whether those happen intentionally or unintentionally. But for my purpose, I'm going to say that a living thing does things intentionally, that it has a causal will, not a free will, but that, as we know, many life forms, they eat things, they reproduce, those kind of things. Because first of all, if life didn't reproduce, then everything would have died out a long time ago. So a lot of living things, they have to reproduce, otherwise the species doesn't continue. And that things change, life changes over time, and it has to respond to its environment in some way. And so I look at life as an intentionally evolving thing through a process of trial and error. um, Different life forms have learned to adapt, and it's more at the cellular level, more at the level of things changing, even at the DNA structure. And I watched a video about viruses recently that got me thinking about viruses being these pieces of DNA that insert themselves into other life forms and weird stuff. And so there's a lot that might be happening even at the DNA level that's changed through life forms intentionally doing something. And of course, we're not in control of it. We don't know how it works, but that doesn't mean that there's not some intention behind it. So, a lot of what I'm saying right now, it might sound like a type of guided evolution. It might sound like a sort of theistic evolution, but my thing is, like, I don't think of, like, when somebody says theistic evolution to me, that implies that there's some type of traditional, like, God, like the Christian, like, that's telling the life forms what well, you evolve into this and you evolve into this and that kind of thing. And I don't think that's what's going on. I think that the life forms themselves, through the fact that they have a drive to survive, seek pleasure and avoid pain, and they reproduce for who knows what reason, that that they are evolving. They're not receiving instructions from, some type of commander somewhere, but they are reacting to their environment in a way that they think will help them survive. And so I view evolution a little bit differently than most people do. Um, and so, I tend to have a broader view of consciousness, than most people do, because a lot of people limit consciousness to only humans. To say, well, only humans are conscious, only humans make choices, only humans can plan ahead and imagine the future and plan accordingly to what they imagine. And I'm like, no, I know too much about animals. I've observed too much animal behavior to think that. So what I want to do is I want to remove the anthropocentrism from our ideas about life. I want us to remove our ideas of anthropocentrism from the belief in God. Because, I mean, I'm not so sure right now whether I'll continue to call myself an atheist or not, because lately I've been seeing some problems with it. And so this is my thoughts at the moment. Of course, this is all subject to change, but seriously, there's something here worth exploring, and I think that that for too long humans have dominated the idea of what God is, or what a creator is, or what, what happened, the origin of things, if there can even be an origin. Of course, I don't think there's an absolute origin, because there's an infinite regress, is what I'll say. But because humans have been the ones, with their hands writing books, writing the ancient holy books, they've been the ones to speak, they've been the ones to teach other humans. But what if we consider, well, what do the horses believe that God is? What do the dogs and the cats? What do the insects believe God is? What do they think? Do they ask these questions? Do they ask, well, was there a first cause? And what do they call that first cause if they believe the first cause? Or even not including a first cause, what do they think is the name for the intelligence that they might perceive in their existence? What is the name they give to life? There's got to be something they're thinking about it. And so many humans are just quick to dismiss and say, oh, these animals don't think about anything. They say they're unconscious, a lot of them will say. And um, I think maybe that they have been considering these things. They have their beliefs just like humans do, but because of the fact that humans don't speak the same language as these other animals, it's difficult for us to interview them. But I pose that as a question for us to consider. Would not a horse, would not a pig, would not, some other animal, like even a fish, if they did believe in a God, wouldn't they attribute their characteristics? They think, well, I'm a fish, I breathe in water, so God breathes in water. They might have a God that's a fish. The horses might have a horse god. And it's so what I'm doing here is I'm pointing out, wait a minute, you can't say that God, whatever it is, since in many religions God is considered a big thing. God's considered an intelligent thing. God's even considered a perfect thing, however you define perfect, which I think is another thing. But to limit it to one species and say that, well, humans are made in the image of God, what they're doing is they're saying, well, God's a human and we're made in God's likeness. So what they're doing is saying, well, we're made in God's image and that God is a human, basically, which brings up the question, well, whose image are all the other animals made in? So here's an interesting idea. What if we're made in the image of life? That we're all life and we're made in the image of life. We're made after the likeness of life. Life begats life. It reproduces and life creates life. Um, and even if there may not be a first life form and you could just have an infinite regress of life forms, I'm not sure how that works, but I hope I've made it clear that I'm opening the discussion of what life is to expand outside of the human context, to think of, if you believe in a God, if you believe in some intelligence, why not attribute it to life? Why not attribute it to biology at some way? I think that this is the start of something, and this has just been my thoughts, but I think it's worth exploring. I think that when humans assume that God is just experiences things as a human, and they talk about consciousness on a human level, which might be different from the consciousness of other animals, I really think that they've been hogging the conversation all this time, and we don't even know what the other humans believe, to be honest. We don't even know what's really going on in other humans' heads. We just know the words they use, and for the large part we assume that we know what people mean when they say God, which is an assumption I've been making terribly, because there's different types of gods that different humans believe in, and I have every reason to suspect that I don't know what people are really meaning when they talk about God. So perhaps we could explore this. Let's talk about life. Let's talk about God and how this might all fit together. So how about George? I've kind of started this. So what do you think so far?
All right, Chandler, yeah, I have a few questions. I mean, I think it's a very interesting theory, just basically the life, I guess, it permeates, I guess, the universe perhaps, or one question I have is like we tend to define life and we distinguish it from inanimate matter in the sense that we define life as, having the possibility of ceasing to function. In other words, like life um, contrasted with death, that if something is alive, it must die, and therefore that requires the need for replication, reproduction, and all. So my first question is perhaps that an anthropocentric understanding of life? In other words, like our human life certainly ceases, and who knows what happens after we die, whatever. But is it possible that a conception of life can extend to, a being, a life that doesn't cease to, that doesn't die, a life that is eternal? Or is that part of your thesis?
Now, that's a very interesting question, George, one that I hadn't considered yet. Because now, when we think of life, we think of different forms of life that they live for a while, then they reproduce, and then they die, and that life carries on through the descendants of the life forms, even though the individual life forms may die. But you raise a question about a type of eternal life form that does not die. Yeah, that's something I hadn't thought about because I think, George, it might be anthropocentric, but I think it comes from our observation that the humans we know, the other animals we know, and even the plants we know, well, that they die at some point, something destroys them, and they stop moving, they stop growing, and that particular thing stops reproducing. So, but it's an interesting question because obviously, like for example, we're a certain number of years old since our birth, and but the matter that makes us up is older than we are. Obviously, all the matter we are existed in in the plants we've eaten. All that makes up our bodies, it's just matter taken from other parts, and matter is not created or destroyed. So it raises the question of whether life is not neither created nor destroyed, just as matter is. So that's kind of an interesting one.
Right. And Chandler, consider this. A scientist named James Lovelock, back in the 60s, presented what came to be known as the Gaia theory. And the theory is that the Earth is a self-governing organism. That basically, like, it governs its climate, it governs its biology and stuff. And when he proposed it in the 60s, it was kind of like it was really out there. It was really a fringe idea and all. Today, that's the accepted paradigm. They see that this Earth is it's an organism. It self-regulates. Through us, we're part of it. Of this self-regulation. Now, the reason I mention this is extend that principle and consider, for example, that we know that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, each of which have hundreds of billions of stars, right? And within those stars, there are many, I would say billions, perhaps hundreds of billions of planets like ours, or you know possibilities for life, like ours or different from ours. So it could be that, like, for example, we could see the entire universe, the entire observable universe as a living organism. Now, I'm not sure that's completely correct because, like, our understanding of the present universe is that it began with the Big Bang. And interestingly, we haven't figured out, at first we thought that it would expand to a certain extent and then collapse in on itself, the great collapse. But now we're learning that the rate of expansion of our observable universe is actually increasing. So you know, it seems like our understanding is it would increase. Basically, my, what you got me thinking about, Chandler, is that the possibility in terms of life that this universe is life. And for example, how our brain or even our body, right? Our body is made of all these different cells, right? And they form together to form this person that we define as a living being. Well, it could be that our planet is one of billions and billions of other planets hosting life that act as kind of like the cells of this universal organism that we can define as life.
Whoa, that's a lot to take in there, but I kind of see what you're saying. See, because I view the living cells inside us as, being like kind of like little people that make up the bigger organism, just as humans, they make companies, they make countries, they make huge societies of many people that work together on certain things, and there's a system of living things that's intentional. So in a way you could say that the cells are the little people that make up the big people, but the big people are part of something that makes up an even bigger person, which is the planet. And then each little planet's a person, which makes up a part of something bigger. And how do you know how far it goes?
Exactly, because I mean, like, again, like our science tells us that our known observable universe started with the Big Bang, but our logic tells us that the Big Bang didn't arise from nothing, that it must have like been created or caused by something. And you're right. So at least temporarily, it would go back into, conceivably an eternal past, and perhaps also spatially, which again, it blows our mind. I mean, we can't conceive of the universe just like, I mean, even the vastness of the known universe is so incomprehensible to us in terms of like, I mean, we think, we can give it a number and stuff, but I mean, like the expanse of it. So yeah, so now in terms of intentionality, Chandler, how would you, so you were explaining how cells have intentionality, human beings have intentionality. Would you extend that principle of intentionality to the rest of the universe? And how would you relate that to your concept of life?
Well, here's the interesting thing, George, is that I'm I'm still not completely sure whether or not, like, whether I can agree to panpsychism or not, which is the idea that all matter is conscious. Like, I mean, I think living things are, but I'm wondering, like, I right now I'm still thinking that there's living things and non-living things, and that the living things are the conscious and intentional things, whereas the dead things, the inanimate things, they remain lifeless until they become part of the energy of a new living organism. So I'm not sure on the distinction and if it makes that much of a difference.
Well, let's say we accept that as a premise. Let's say we accept that, that a rock is unconscious, but, living organisms are. How relate that to intentionality? In other words, like, would you attribute intentionality to, I mean, would you define as what created, let's say, life on Earth as life? In other words, like life giving birth to or just manifesting another type of life.
Yeah, I would have to say that there's got to be some reasoning behind why life continues to create new forms of life. And it's also very interesting because since life changes from generation to generation, it seems to me that there's there seems to be this idea that life can create future generations of life that it somehow sees as even better somehow. I don't know exactly, um, but there's something about this because there's different life forms. There's the tiniest of things, but they get bigger and bigger over time. There seems to be some type of experience that I think would have to drive things. There has to be some consciousness and intentionality, but I'm not sure exactly.
No, yeah. So, like, in other words, like two examples. For example, before there were flying organisms, birds and all, insects, there may have been, land-born or sea-born life that had the thought, gee, it'd be nice to be able to fly, right? And it was just a thought in their consciousness. And then millions of years through this kind of like, process of like, you think it, you dream it first, then it manifests. Who knows? Maybe as human beings, like the only thing we dislike about reality is pain, suffering. So like to the extent that we have this thought, gee, it'd be nice if we could like exist, or if our, our progeny could exist, completely in this bliss, that maybe Chandler, maybe these thoughts that we have are part of this living evolutionary process that then manifests, over millions or tens or hundreds of millions of years into the actual biology.
Yeah, and when you look at the fact that we seek pleasure and avoid pain, you notice how much of what we do is toward the avoidance of pain. And take, for example, the belief in heaven that people have, that after they die they're going to go to a place of bliss where there's no pain. I mean that reveals a desire to be away from pain, and it's interesting because I'm not sure how we could explain if there's an origin to pleasure and pain, or if it's something that, in some way, um, life forms have always had this sense of that I like this better than this. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's interesting. I think you're right. And I think even with a single-celled organism, we can make that claim. In other words, you put a paramecium amoeba in a Petri dish, it might move toward the light or toward the dark or toward the heat or toward the cold. So it does have a kind of preference. And now, in terms of like then conjecturing as to whether that preference would reflect itself in a pleasure, being where it wants to be, and an adverse reaction or not, that's questionable. It could be. It actually could be. I mean, like we were talking before about, I was doing a bit of research on the origins of sentience, pleasure and pain. And again, they may have gotten it wrong. They may be kind of like defining it based on biology, whereas I think we're extending this way beyond biology to kind of like mechanisms that we don't understand. So like their understanding was that it created that sentient life began with these crustaceans called decapods, which includes lobsters and crabs about 350 million years ago. And their understanding was that there was no organisms with pleasure and pain beyond before that. But I think just as like many scientists would not attribute consciousness to cells, to single cells, I think it maybe that kind of flawed reasoning that leads us to believe that maybe single cells are not sentient. It's an interesting, very interesting question.
Well, it's difficult. I think part of the problem is that because people have no way of perceiving the consciousness as something else, they just make this assumption that, oh, it's not conscious. Because they don't know the intentions of another life form, they just don't think there is an intention. And I think what's interesting is, they do that with other animals. They don't say that those animals intentionally did something. They just say, oh well, they have instinct. And I'm like, well, functionally, what's the difference?
That's a very good point, Chandler, because we have instinct. In other words, like our I mean, we have learning and stuff, but who's to say they don't have learning? And like, instinct, what is instinct but like kind of like learning at the cellular, even the level of DNA. You have different organisms kind of like learning that, let's say they're in an environment that's not ideal to their continued replication, reproduction. So at the DNA level, they will, there's a process of this mutation. And I think random is a very bad term to describe, because it's not random in any real sense. But so this process of mutation, whereby at the level of DNA and RNA, you know, they are kind of like planning for the future. They're planning for like ancestors to be able to evolve different forms. So that has to be viewed as a conscious, intelligent, intentful process.
Yeah, I think there's so much intentionality to things. I mean, and let's talk about something that's intentional versus unintentional, because, um, for example, there's a difference between something that happens, like somebody slipping on a banana peel they didn't realize that was there. We call that an accident. We don't say that somebody did that on purpose when they slip on a banana peel or something. That we call it a mistake. We call it something that happens from a lack of knowledge about something. But we make a distinction between, for example, somebody who has the intention to kill somebody and somebody who ends up killing somebody accidentally. Like they run over something with their car and don't know it's there. Like that, of course, that happens with squirrels quite often, and of course, it's happened with human children. Where they don't realize there's a kid, behind their car when they're backing up and stuff, and so they unintentionally kill something, but they have no idea about it. So there's stuff that happens is not intentional, that just happens due to the fact that something is unknown and that something's not considered, but that it happens. But we have to still say that most things that happen, there's an intention behind it, you know, because I think that some things happen so often that you have to say they're intentional. I mean, this seeking of pleasure and avoidance of pain sure can't just be an accident. It can't be just a coincidence. It happens because there's something real going on there, and something has to be aware that it's experiencing pleasure or pain to move away from something that it doesn't like, or to move towards something it does like you mentioned about the light. If something moves towards the light, that implies in some way it gets some pleasure from the light. Maybe the heat the light generates, it can feel it somehow, or it can see the light and like, ooh, there's a light. And I know bugs are fascinated with light.
Right, and well, Chandler, then, that invites the question, for example, if there's, you know, I mean, was there a beginning? Because, like, we're talking about life, like with life, was there a beginning of sentient life, or was life always sentient? In which case we're asking, well, like, is life kind of like, first, is it eternal? Is it universal? And if so, I kind of, I would hope that that sentience developed, because if sentience developed, then the prospect arises, whereby, I think, from our perspective as human beings, it was a mistake for pain and suffering to evolve. I mean, we have no problem with pleasure and happiness, but this mechanism that created suffering. So it would be nice to kind of like conceive of an intention, a life force. If you want to, if we're, you know, exploring this from the perspective of life, some kind of life that may not have experienced themselves or itself whatever pain, or maybe even pleasure, who knows, but then decided intentionally, with a purpose, because I think intention basically denotes purpose, to morph or or manifest aspects of itself, because I'm not sure we can even refer to what it's doing as creating new life, but like to manifest aspects of itself that then do suffer, both would suffer pain and and then also enjoy pleasure. And then the question would become, well, what would have been the reason for that or the purpose for that?
It's interesting because one thing is I think that there's still the idea of, like, let's say that we take away the physical sensations of pleasure and pain. Obvious, like, where something, if it's hit, it doesn't feel anything, that it's completely numb. But imagine if we were like that, we would still perhaps have the emotional type of pleasure and pain that we get when we look at something and say, oh, well, we like the way this looks better than the way that looks. We like the way this sound sounds more than this other sound. So I think there's still a preference and still a liking and disliking at a lower level, even if a life form didn't experience the type of pleasure and pain that we know. So, but yeah, obviously that's a reduced type of pleasure and pain, and it's not so serious. I would love the idea if of life forms at the lower levels not experiencing, pain like we do. I would sure hope not.
Right, or the guiding, like basically it seems like at the cellular level, at the level of, I mean, our understanding is that, life on Earth evolved from enzymes, creating proteins, then creating single-celled organisms. But like, it basically goes from the inanimate to the animate, basically like from these chemicals, these enzymes, these carbon, these elements that are, by our understanding, not biological, that then create a biology that has all the characteristics of life. So then the question becomes like, the intention of this being on, this life that created this life. I mean, another point I wanted to address, Chandler, is like in terms of like, having the enjoyment and lack of enjoyment that's emotional, at a certain level, we have to acknowledge that it all goes down to neurochemistry. In other words, like when we're experiencing a pleasant emotion, that's a physical experience because like there are certain neurochemicals, neurotransmitters that are being released, and it has a physical manifestation. I'm not sure we can escape the physicality of this experience of pain and pleasure, or differentiate between emotional and physical. But in terms of like this life that gave rise to the biology, I guess basically like we're exploring the nature of this life. What is it about? Does it have intention? It seems to have intention.
Yeah. See, what's interesting, for example, what somebody would do, like if they're trying to, like here, when we talk about life, I think, take for example, when somebody is studying horses, for example, well, they don't just study one horse. They look at lots of different horses, and they try to, and of course, somebody at some point had to figure out, well, what makes a horse a horse? What, just like what makes a human, what makes a dog? And you have to consider, well, what makes life life? Because there has to be some kind of common characteristics that is common to all life forms. Otherwise, how can they all be called life unless there's some kind of definition of life? And of course, like you said, there's many different definitions of life. So perhaps we need to think about what the definition of life most accurately is, and if this includes what type of intention or consciousness this includes, and what type of pleasure or pain this includes.
That's a great question. Um, I'm thinking, okay, you have a basic element like carbon, hydrogen, or you have different, you have rocks, you have inanimate matter that they basically are governed by, controlled by the laws of nature. If a carbon molecule is unites with a hydrogen, then you'll have CH, whatever. You have these different compounds, but they're basically guided by these laws of chemistry. According to their nature, according to their chemical bonds and all their characteristics. So then, but now we have to differentiate that kind of matter from when it becomes a cell that's capable of replicating. I mean, that's been one of the fundamental criteria of biological life. I think we're kind of like positing that perhaps the life that created this biological kind of life may not have a time span. It may be eternal, but I think we can, yeah, I think we can posit that the difference between a hydrogen molecule and a living cell um, is that the living cell, I think it's conscious. I think is aware. In other words, like the hydrogen molecule is just responding um, to the laws of nature. It's just acting, you know, like for example, gravity will pull matter toward each other. Whereas like the cell has an additional whether we can define it as consciousness or whether we can like attribute intentionality to it also. That basically just like DNA kind of like confers to us a certain kind of a genetic predisposition to act in certain ways, instinct and all, that the living the living being or whatever we want to describe it that gives rise to the cellular life is imparting it is endowing it with intentionality of its own. So a cell has its own kind of purpose, whereas a carbon molecule and a hydrogen molecule may not.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thought. See, now, I don't know much about the elements, but from what I understand, there's like, I don't know, 103 elements. Um, and I know that hydrogen and carbon and oxygen and there's a whole bunch of others I couldn't possibly know the names of. Um, but it's an interesting thought because it like from I think I've heard or read something about life evolving from a hydrogen atom, and I don't know about that exactly. But it's an interesting thing because one idea is that life is eternal, which is sort of what I'm presenting in this thing, that there was always some life form. Another idea is the idea that life somehow evolved from non-life, but then we're still stuck with the problem is even if that can happen, let's say that can happen, that non-life things that are non-living, that certain elements can come together and make life. Well, there's two things that means. First of all, we still are stuck with the thing, well, where did the non-life come from, and the nature of that being eternal. But then we also are stuck with this idea, well, if non-life can become life, then what's to say that this doesn't happen in several places all over our infinite universe, basically? You know what I'm saying?
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
if life can evolve on one planet from the elements there, then it can do on another the same way. So either way, whether you believe that life evolved from non-life somehow, or whether it's eternal, either way, you've got to conclude that there could be life in all kinds of places we don't even know about, and all kinds of planets, and maybe even the stars, some type of life that can live in the heat.
Absolutely. Again, within all of this, we have to always remember that we are only aware of 4 or 5% of the universe we know is out there. 96%, we know it's out there, but aside from it having a gravitational influence, we know nothing about it. So, like, I think, yeah, I think it would be, you know, we have to conclude that life is abundant in the universe. With the billions, hundreds of billions of galaxies each, with hundreds of billions of stars, it would be highly improbable that there weren't, billions of other, life forms throughout the entire universe. But in Chandler, I think I definitely agree with you with what you said before in terms of, like, I don't think it's conceptually possible for life to evolve from non-life. Just like I don't think that conceptually you can have order evolving from disorder or non-order. In other words, like, non-order or disorder might be defined also as randomness or something. In other words, you have to have a guiding kind of causality, guiding kind of, like, order. And I think that's one of the principal properties of the life you're describing that gave rise to this biological life.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I also think the concept of order and disorder has several problems because, you know, we make when we don't understand something, we tend to call it disorder. When we don't understand what causes something, we call it random, and so there's order even in the disorder. It's just that we're not always educated enough to see why something is the way it is.
I agree completely, absolutely. Because I mean, it's all causal. There has to be an order. You can't have order arising from disorder. So, all right, if we apply this to your theory of like this 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 omnipresent life, in a sense, that life is everywhere, or that life is, that there's a life that extends beyond biology, then we're giving it intentionality and potentially an eternal nature. How else are you describing this? This life that seems to pervade not just biology, but much of the rest of the universe.
Well, here's what's interesting about it is now when we think of living things, we think of them moving without some other object hitting it. We tend, for example, we know that we're not billiard balls on a table. We know that those balls only move when something else hits them, another ball or the pool cue or somebody's hand or whatever. But one of the central things is that living things, they move without having to have something constantly make them move. So it's interesting because, of course, consciousness is one thing because something could be, you could say something might be conscious, but it not necessarily move. You know what I'm saying? And perhaps the reason that we call something inorganic matter is because we don't see it move. What we call it dead or non-living when we don't see it move, but we think of something that moves when we call it living. Something that moves, but we're not making it move. It's, moving, quote unquote, of its own accord, sort of in a way.
All right, so Chandler, so are you positing that, for example, yeah, just as we human biological organisms move, that there's a kind of, like, life that isn't biological, that I think you're positing isn't isn't omnipresent. In other words, it may not fill the entirety of the universe, but it may move within throughout the universe. Maybe beyond the speed of light. Who knows at what rate it might move? But you have this kind of, like, life force. Kind of like a physical force, like the forces of nature, gravity and all, that's capable of locomotion, and that might explain, for example, why there is life in certain parts of the universe and perhaps not life in others.
Yeah, there's got to be some kind of force, it would seem. Just like we know, like we don't see gravity exactly, but we see things being pulled somewhere. Um, and well, that's an interesting thought because we don't actually see a life force but I don't know if life is electrical somehow. I don't know what you would call it, but life could be maybe a fundamental force of nature in some way. And I don't remember what the forces of nature are, the ones that we have names for exactly. But there's something about it that when something dies, um, well, you still see that, that body of that animal that died. You see it there, but it's no longer moving. So it appears to be something like, well, a machine, like an electrical machine, when somebody's taken away the electricity. It stops moving, it stops doing what it does. Even the computers that people build, you can set something to defragment, you can set something to download, and the computer keeps doing that thing even while you're gone doing something else. But it's weird because d- death seems to be a cessation of movement, at least from what we can see.
Yeah, and what complicates it, for example, like with a heart transplant, you have a heart that I don't think is like, it's taken from one person, and I don't think it's beating at that point, right? I think it's basically, once they remove it from the person, I think it's just like, it's organic and all, but I don't think it's functioning. They put it into another person, hook it up and all, and I guess with electricity, I'm not sure of the details, then they get this heart pumping again, and all of a sudden, this other person is alive. I mean, I guess its brain is alive. I guess it has some kind of like blood flowing through the system, whatever. But so there's this kind of like there's this essence of life that we don't understand. But Chandler, I mean, like I want to return to this kind of like this. You're positing that this life that is non-biological extends throughout the universe, moves, that it's capable of locomotion. Now, like when we move, when biological organisms move, there's an intention to our movement. So what would you posit might be an intention to the life that extends beyond us? Why might it move?
Well, I mean, I can't be sure exactly. It's still a new idea, but yeah, there's always an intention when we move. There's some intention to do something. And so I'm not exactly sure, um, why what the intention is for each living thing, but in some way there's got to be some intention, and I'm not sure what drives things to do what they do. I mean, take for example the fact that things do reproduce, and I'm like, well, I mean, why is that? I mean, we know that's the way it is, but I don't know if we can find a satisfactory answer for why life forms are curious. They're always, want to look at new things and have new experiences, and they tend to reproduce, and it's I don't know. There's so much to this idea, and each intention probably has another intention behind it, just like a person does this because they want to get this other thing. Well, why do they want that other thing? Because they need that thing to do this, and if you look, just like with the humans, you look and say, well, everything that people do somehow seems to revolve around, first of all, food and water, but then there's also, the sexual desire of most people, which somehow implies some drive to reproduce, which I don't fully understand. But that's interesting. I think that comes from a lower level of some need, some desire, some intention of life forms to reproduce.
Well, and we can gonna go even deeper than that. Like for example, Aristotle said that like the only end in life is happiness. Everything else we do is a means to happiness. So whether we're eating, whether we're reproducing, whatever, we're doing it because somehow it brings us pleasure and happiness to do that. Who knows why that is? But happiness seems to be the fundamental motivation to why, not just I think human beings, but other sentient organisms will do what they do. Now, if we apply this to the life, the non-biological universal life that, gave birth to this biological life, then I guess we can kind of like posit a similar kind of motive that just as like as we human beings, we will create music, we will create art, we will like, build furniture all for our enjoyment. So this life, you know, kind of like decided to create this self-reproducing, biological life for its own enjoyment, for its own happiness. It apparent, I mean that is a somewhat an anthropocentric, basically interpretation of why this life might do something. But yeah, I think we're kind of somewhat at a loss at explaining, the more overall motivation of why, inanimate or universal life might create a biological life.
Yeah, you know what I want to do? I want to look some things up in my word of dictionary. I want to look up biological, um, because one definition one is pertaining to biology or to life and living things, and two is of parents and children related by blood. But yeah, I'll go to the definition of life because it's important that we have things properly defined too.
Okay.
Because, one says a characteristic state or mode of living, two, the experience of being alive, the course of human events and activities. Well, that's very anthropocentric. um, three, the course of existence of an individual, the actions and events that occur in living. Four, the condition of living or the state of being alive. Five, the period during which something is functional, as between birth and death.
Chandler, you might want to just like keyword life and wiki and go to the wiki page on life. It does tend to define the distinguishing characteristics of life in various ways.
Yeah, that's something I'll want to do. Okay, so let's see. Let me go to wikipedia.com because yeah, Wikipedia will probably explain it better than just, my quick word web dictionary. Let's see. Life. I'm going to search for life because this is yeah, let's see. Life is a characteristic distinguishing physical entities having biological processes, such as signaling and self-sustaining processes, from those that do not, either because such functions have ceased death or because they lack such functions and are classified as inanimate. Various forms of life exist, such as plants, animals, fungi, protists, archaea, and bacteria. Their criteria can at times be ambiguous and may or may not define viruses, viroids, or potential artificial life as living. Biology is the primary science concerned with the study of life, although many other sciences are involved.
Okay, one thing I would question is like right from the beginning, distinguishing physical entities having biological processes such as signaling from those that do not. Now, for example, like, entangled particles in physics, there are two particles that are entangled, and one of them has a characteristics, let's say an upspin, right? And it could be theoretically at one end of the universe. The other entangled particle in this pair could be at the other end, separated by billions and billions and trillions of billions of light years away. And like if you change the spin from up to down on one of those entangled particles, the other one would change also. So I think you can call that signaling. I mean, it operates at a rate that's instantaneous, that's faster than the speed of light, which actually, we don't know how it does that. But so in other words, what I'm saying is like, so this definition of life, may be a bit limiting, in other words, also a self-sustaining process, goes on like, and again, they're referring to these as biological processes, but maybe signaling and self-sustaining processes um, are are also non-biological. For example, like with physics, there's the law of conservation of mass energy that says that you can neither create nor destroy matter. So, like, you have an element. Well, it's interesting because, like, I was going to say a hydrogen um, molecule. Once it's been created, it can't be destroyed. But what's interesting about that is that so it is self-sustaining in that sense. It's going to always exist. This hydrogen, it can be like in various compounds, various forms, but you can't destroy that hydrogen. Um, but it did have a beginning. In other words, like to our understanding, it wasn't always a hydrogen molecule. I think like in the Big Bang, these elements developed. But I think my overall point is that like the definition of life here in Wiki, relating it to biological processes, that the same principles that they're attributing to this biology may also extend to the elements, and to subatomic particles.
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's really interesting because I mean, how can I say that the tiniest that the stuff inside the atoms, the protons, neutrons, and electrons, I mean, how do I know whether or not they might meet the kind of idea of life I'm having?
Exactly. And that's the good question, Chandler. In other words, how can we know that? We're kind of like we say human beings are conscious. Some of us say human beings are conscious because we have a certain kind of, biology. We have, a brain and all this stuff. But then when we look at the behavior of single-celled organisms, we don't understand their biology in terms of like their mechanisms, but they perform some of the same behaviors that we do. So you're right. So even when you go beyond the point of the cell, um, it's a bit more of a difficult case to make for these particles that they're kind of like, that they're not being governed by the forces that move them. But you're right. How we can't really know, in a certain sense, whether they're conscious or not.
It's very interesting because, like I've said before, we can't access the consciousness of another life form, including even other humans. So when scientists are experimenting on the brain of somebody, they still have to ask the person what they're feeling, what they're thinking, And because we're not really capable of talking to and we're not, we don't speak the same language as a cat or and not insects and the tiniest life forms. We can't ask the amoeba or whatever what it's thinking, so we can't ask the atom what it's thinking, if it's thinking, I mean, it's so what's interesting is that there's always going to be a certain amount of unknown about this. And here's the interesting thing now, because people, they're very resistant to accept an idea that somebody proposes, but they're not going to believe something unless they have extreme evidence and an explanation for all of it. But there are some things that we won't be able to explain. But with this conversation, I'm just looking for, expanding the idea of life beyond, the human context that we think of, beyond the mammal context, beyond to all sorts of things, big and small, discussing whether the universe is an organism or the known universe, or whether a planet is a self-regulating organism or something like that. You know, we need to think really big and we need to think really small because there's always something smaller inside something small. So yeah, I mean, this is interesting. And now let's think about it. Now, first, we've spent a little over an hour just talking about what these ideas are. What is life? And is life eternal and all this sort of thing. But let's talk about the implications of this. Let's consider the idea that if somebody believes this or doesn't, what does it mean for them? Because now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see any harm in thinking of these little cells as people. Thinking of tiny life forms as having some consciousness, some awareness. Having some intention. I don't see any harm in that. I'm not right now. I'm not so sure what the benefits of this belief would be either, but I think it makes sense. I think that life makes much more sense when you think of living things, intentionally doing things, having desires and intentionally doing things, rather than the type of evolution that many people have taught to them. Oh, it's just all random mutation and natural selection. And I mean, I think if natural selection holds in the sense that, well, yes, the environment means that certain organisms will reproduce and others won't if they can't take that environment and what it does to them. But that there still seems to be some intention to adapt to an environment which comes from some type of desire or instinct, whatever you call it, to survive and also to reproduce.
Right. So this intentionality, as we were saying before, is conferred, by this non-biological life to this biological life. Now you're asking, what are the practical implications of this? How can we use this knowledge? One way I can think of is, we were talking before about the paranormal, clairvoyance. In other words, people knowing things that defy our understanding of reality in terms of the mechanism of how they know. You have these kind of like people who like I read an account of a a harp that had been stolen after a performance, and this woman, for 3 days they couldn't locate it, right? So she was advised to ask this person who was, I think, several states away to try to, like, think of where this harp might be. And so, like, this person has this gift, whatever, of being able to, like, know things that other people, that we think can't be known. Anyway, this person's able to, like, locate it within a block or something. They find the harp and all. This is one example, but the idea is, like, to the extent that we attribute intentionality and consciousness to this non-biological life, and we kind of like conclude that the intentions of biological life have to come from this non-biological life, then I think we can posit that there can be perhaps communication between biological life and this non-biological life. And that may be what the paranormal was, paranormal research has been trying to do. Now, Chandler, you and I were talking before about, for example, I was explaining that Duke University, Princeton University, Stanford University, all have demonstrated that, for example, there is preponderance evidence for clairvoyance. There's some evidence for remote sensing for some of these paranormal abilities, and the idea would be, like, to the extent that that we recognize the intentionality, the consciousness, the purposefulness of inanimate, quote unquote, life, then we expand our understanding of reality beyond, this kind of like parochial view that, like, no, there, we can only communicate in ways that that are conventional. That opens up an entire new area. Now, who knows if we can, if we can develop these abilities, just like we developed our intelligence and our memory and all, to be able to, to serve humankind in the future. But it does just expand our understanding of the nature of reality.
Well, it's interesting because I'm right at this point. I'm not so sure what I think of, so-called paranormal things or not. But before we continue with that, I want to ask what you said. Something you were talking about biological life and non-biological life, And I'm not sure because I thought biological meant it was related to something living. So I kind of think that biological means you're talking about something living. So I don't know if there's such a thing as non-biological life.
Well, that's what I was asking because, like, our understanding of life, seems to be that enzymes came together to form the initial proteins that then assembled into the initial cells. So when you were kind of like positing a life that that permeates the universe, I thought you were kind of like getting it at a kind of a life that we may not understand the mechanism for, but a kind of life that let's say um, gave the instructions for these enzymes to come together. In other words, like it seems difficult to believe that this the coming together of enzymes into cells and cells into replicating into like more and more complex organisms resulting in human beings. It seems like that wouldn't be an arbitrary process. That wouldn't be just a process that happened without some kind of an intentionality, even at the fundamental level. So when you were kind of like describing life, I thought that that's what you were getting at, that the universe is kind of like imbued, or that within the universe there's a kind of life that isn't biological the way we understand it, but nonetheless has the characteristics of life in terms of like it being purposeful, intent, conscious, so like if that's not what your original thesis was, can you restate it so we can be clear on that?
Yeah, because I was talking about, what it kind of means to for something to be alive, and we think of consciousness, we think of awareness, something being aware and having an intention to do something, which comes from some desire to do something. So I think we've got consciousness, we've got some kind of desire. And as far as the whole, like the biological, non-biological thing, I'm pretty sure that something is biological when it relates to something that's alive. So I'm not so sure. I mean, yeah, I don't know exactly, and that could just be semantics either. I'm not so sure if it makes that much of a difference, but there's definitely more to life than what it could be known in our so-called biology so far. That
Right, because Chandler, the question we're asking is we understand that life has intentionality. Even single cells, their intention is to replicate, so they replicate, they divide. They reproduce, then they colonize, whatever. So intentionality does seem to be a characteristic of life. But then the next question that we'd have to ask is like, well, what was there an intention that created that life? In other words, like, can we assign intentionality to whatever it was that instructed these or whatever, that had these first enzymes come together and had this whole process evolve and lead to human beings?
Well, this is interesting because now, whatever type of thing that we say, if an intention behind the intention of these other life forms is what you're saying, right?
Right.
Well, here's the deal: is that type of cause of the other life would have to have the intentions and the consciousness in some sense, so it would be a life form in and of itself in some way. And of course, then you could always propose, well, there's a life behind that life and a life behind that life. So we kind of have an infinite life regression, don't we?
Right, and that's like, yeah. So like, I think we can posit that, because I thought that's what you were getting at in the beginning, that just to have, ascribing intentionality to a non-biological life Because if we go there, and you're right, then we're faced with the infinite regress, and logic cannot help us there, right? The one thing we might be able to conclude is that this life, if you define the governing entity, the governing being as life, that has consciousness and intentionality, yes, it has a history that goes back eternally into the past, but it may be eternal. In other words, like it may be just for example, like we're a human being existing in this moment, and then we're existing in the next moment, and the next moment after that, and the next moment after that, and we're the same human being. It's not like we have to like recreate ourselves each moment to continue to exist. So it might be that this primordial life, you know, may be self-sustaining, eternally self-sustaining, with a kind of like an eternal consciousness.
Well, yeah, here's an interesting idea. Now, okay, I suppose I think you'll like this idea. Let's propose that the universe was some sort of living organism somehow. Um, well, which is kind of weird because then it's sort of like an infinite living system, but that we're all small parts of it. Well, what's interesting is that normally when something dies, when life forms that we think of, humans or other animals or a tree or whatever, when something dies, something causes it to die. Something hurts it in such a way that that organism can't recover fast enough. Usually, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or like let's say that there's some problem. If something causes the internal organs damage in of some human, if it's severe enough and it's not repaired quick enough, then the system, which is all connecting, can shut down. But here's the deal. Let's say that the universe was some sort of organism. Now, what in the world could cause it to die? What could damage it?
Well, and I would have to say nothing. In other words, like I mean, like you would have to then posit that the universe is causing itself to die, and that kind of like doesn't seem so very common, logical. In other words, why would an organism that we're defining as a living organism, the universe, want itself to die? Usually, to the extent that we understand death, it's something that's imposed right upon biological life. So that's why I'm positing that perhaps this universal life doesn't die because it can't die because it can't cause itself to die.
Well, yeah, it's kind of weird because think about it. Now, we have all sorts of living cells in our bodies, but we aren't able to say, oh, well, I want this cell to live and that cell to die. I mean, we can't do that. And it's usually it'll be say a car wreck or some human shooting us with a gun, or having eaten something that contains some deadly bacteria that ends up causing damage that the immune system can't fight off. Something outside of us is what causes us to die. Rather, we don't just obviously we don't just self-cause anything. We don't have a free will, so we can't freely will ourselves to just die and drop dead. Something else has to cause us to, you know, and but there's nothing outside of the universe because we're talking about the universe in the sense of all of reality, everything that exists everywhere. So we have to conclude there's nothing outside of existence that could kill existence. Like, how would that even work?
Exactly, exactly. So then you have this a kind of a life form that unlike biological life, appears to be eternal. And then, are we imbuing it with a consciousness? It seems like it has an intentionality, at least in having created biological life. Because, like, as we were saying, if we're applying this principle of nothing can be cause a sui to biological life cannot have caused itself to emerge, right? So it must have been caused by something. And I think it makes a lot more sense to ascribe intentionality to this universal life that created or manifested biological life than just to suppose that biological life came about arbitrarily, without any intention.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it seems to me that there would have to be, an eternality to the intention and the consciousness that makes up life. I mean, that's pretty. I think that's pretty essential to have those things to have life. Um, so yeah, it's interesting, and let's talk about how this relates to people's belief in God, because um, people say, well, God is the creator of life. But then, if we have them on our show, we'll want to ask them, well, is God alive?
Yeah, and I would have to say yes. I think, like, based on our discussion tonight, we would have to conclude that God would have to be alive to create quote unquote life. Because just like, whatever, if we're defining like the universe as being alive, then anything within the universe would have to be part of it. So in other words, like, biological life has to have been created from this more expansive universal life. And we could term that God. We could say, well, God is this universal life.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the idea of, like what I'm kind of calling this is I'm kind of calling it biotheism. You know what I mean? Bio meaning life, like in biology, biological. So I would call it biotheism, just as, for example, you've talked about pantheism, and pan is some word that means all, so it's basically all theism, which is like all that exists is God. But this is an idea where we're talking specifically about the central thing of importance, which is life, and that defining God as this universal life. And here's the important thing is that, this is just kind of an idea I've been having in more recent times. And it's not, I mean, the word God has a tendency to put people off, obviously, because when people in America, I know, you hear the word God and you think of, the God that hates gay people. You think of the God that sends people to hell. You think of this mean God which is described as some being with human-like emotions that gets really mad at the humans and blames them for choosing to disobey him. Which, of course, you and I, we have issues with that. We take issue with the idea that God could blame humans for what God made them do. Which is kind of a strange thing. And, in our last two podcasts, we were talking about, the attributes of God. You were talking about the omniscience, the omnipresence, omnipotence, and weird stuff like that. But when what we're doing is we're trying to give a name to something, and I mean, I tend to shy away from the word God, because it has a loaded meaning. It tends to be a specific meaning, which may differ in your country depending on what the dominant religion is in your country. There might be one God that the people believe in. There might be many gods, and they all have different things about them. Um, but we need to come to, well, what is behind these different types of gods are that we are given, that we hear about, that we read on the internet. Well, those definitions are given by humans. And well, what are humans? They are a form of life. They are one of the animals that is alive. And they're the ones writing the books about God, preaching about God. But they're life forms but life forms come from other life forms, which come from other life forms. And so what we have is, well, why would this particular one species of animal on one planet be the authority on what God is, or what life is, or what the universe is, or whatever? You know what I'm saying? Because why would some, like, for example, it doesn't make very much sense to conduct a survey, like when somebody conducts a survey of people's opinion, like say on a political issue or something. Let's say that somebody polls people on whether they believe climate change is real. Well, they can ask a million people in the US and come up with a statistic based on those people that they interviewed. But if you poll a million people in the U.S., you're going to get a different answer than the U.K. or India or China. You're going to get a different answer because you're going to get a different million people who grew up in a different environment, that have a different education system. And so it's just terrible to take a small part of the population in a certain area and expect them to provide the answers of reliability of anything. Humans are just one species on one planet in this endless universe. And so there's always going to be mystery. There's always going to be something that we don't know. And that's something that I have to be okay with, just not knowing certain things, because I know that, like, as an individual, there will come a time when Chandler Klebs is no more, but life will still go on. Life continues in other life forms because of this constant reproduction. And so I don't think life had a beginning. I don't think life had an end. It just changes form.
Yeah, it's interesting when we explore the notion of knowledge, what we can know, because you're right. I mean, we're subjective beings on one planet, when this vast universe that we can really define as being alive in a sense. Um, a lot of it we can't know, but there are actually some things that we can know. And that, I mean, it'd be interesting to have a podcast just dedicated to trying to enumerate them. In other words, like one thing we can know is that reality exists. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, you can't refute that, right? I mean, reality exists.
Yes.
And more, I guess, along the lines of Descartes, we can know that we exist, right? Or we have a consciousness. Our consciousness exists. And maybe in a certain sense, he was right. Maybe that's the only thing we can be absolutely sure of. But beyond that, I think, like, this relates to our free will work, refuting free will. I think we can be, objectively, I think, absolutely sure that causality exists.
Well,
That,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, here's the thing, George, is now a lot of people are afraid to talk about this. They're afraid to consider this. A lot of people, they're afraid to express their beliefs anywhere, um, because there's so much fighting over religion. There's different fighting over different beliefs about things. Um, and also, people are afraid, well, if I have the wrong belief about God, then I'll go to hell. There's people who have that belief that's been drilled into them. But since that depends on free will belief, you have to be fundamentally responsible for freely choosing to believe the wrong thing. Then you realize you can't be blamed for believing things based on the evidence you have, on the experiences you've had, and on what you've heard from other people and how that interacts with your experiences. And the fact that we're not really able to overcome what we want to believe. We have our emotions, which compel us to believe certain things, even if it's crazy. So I think we need to consider that nobody's to blame, for what they believe or don't believe. And from that foundation, we can open up the discussion so that people who are afraid to talk about this will feel safe talking about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, like, this belief in free will, which, religions use to basically threaten people with eternal damnation, I mean, it's extremely intimidating. So once we move beyond that, then people can begin to think better for themselves, consider things that they're, like, imagine if somebody's really, really, somebody's threatening somebody's life or threatening major harm to somebody, if they consider something, if they refuse to believe something, you can see how that's going to like interfere with the person's reasoning processes. So that's what's happening with the whole free will thing. People's beliefs, people's like fear of hell, their religious beliefs are interfering with their thinking, and it just wreaks havoc on so much of our interaction with ourselves, with the whole of our reality.
Yeah, there's this fear because when somebody's fearful, they aren't really thinking right, you know?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, we've been talking for a little over an hour and a half, so it's probably time for us to shut up soon. Yeah, so I guess, should I close out this episode?
Sounds good.
All right, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs and George Ortega, and we've been talking about life and how that involves consciousness and intentions, and how this might relate to people's belief in God and what life is exactly, and did life come from non-life or is it eternal? I mean, big questions that if you're kind of a nerd who likes to talk about these big questions, then hey, you might have enjoyed listening to this and let us know what you think. And thank you for listening, and goodbye.